will be a very short explanation of the relationships between a firm's short-run per unit costs of production. Now, we're not going to go into a lot of detail about the shapes of these curves necessarily, because this was explained in a previous lesson in which we compared the productivity of labor in the short run to the costs of production in the short run. If you're hoping to learn about how productivity affects a firm's short run costs, then you should go back and watch that previous lesson. Today we just want to focus on 3 short run per unit costs of production curves. Specifically, we're going to look at marginal cost, which I'll draw here, average variable cost, which I'm drawing now, and average total cost, which I've drawn here. Let's start off with marginal cost. A couple of very important things to know about marginal cost. As you can see here, there is a range of output over which the firm's marginal cost of production, in other words, the cost of each additional unit produced, declines. This range, the yellow range of our marginal cost curve, represents the range over which the firm experiences increasing marginal returns to labor. So when marginal cost falls, the output of additional workers is greater than the workers hired before. However, beyond a certain level of output, if the firm continues to employ more workers, we begin to see the marginal cost increase. In other words, the cost of additional units of output rises. This occurs because of diminishing marginal returns. So when marginal cost is rising, the output of additional workers is less than the workers hired before. In other words, the firm is experiencing diminishing marginal returns. So the shape of the marginal cost curve is very simple. It's simply inversely related to the productivity of labor. When productivity of additional workers increases, marginal cost decreases. When productivity begins to decrease, however, marginal cost increases. Now let's look at the average variable cost curve. We need to look at a couple of ranges of the ABC curve here in order to understand why the curve is shaped the way that it is. So average variable cost, this refers to the total variable cost, in other words, the total wage costs of a firm divided by the quantity of output. Notice that over a particular range of output, average variable cost is declining. The per unit wage costs of the firm decrease as long as the marginal cost of production is less than the average variable cost. So we can say that AVC decreases until it intersects marginal cost, and then it increases. Now there's a very logical explanation for this. As long as the additional unit that the firm produced costs less than the average unit cost, the average unit cost decreases. The example I give my class is that we can take the total height of everybody in our class. Let's say that the total height of everybody in our class is 1,000 centimeters, and there are 5 people in our class. That gives us an average height of 200 centimeters. That's a small class, but a tall class. Now, if one more person walks into the room that is only 150 centimeters in height, the students know right away the average height in the room will fall. The marginal height is the height of the last person to enter the room. The average height is the total height divided by the number of people. So if you think about a real-world example of any time the value of an additional unit is less than the value of an average unit, the average falls. If the cost of an additional unit of output is less than the average cost, the average falls. However, beyond the point where marginal cost intersects average, average begins to rise. We can see that on our graph here. So average variable cost increases when marginal cost is greater than average variable cost. So that brings us to the average total cost curve. What is average total cost? ATC, average total cost, is the average variable cost plus the average fixed cost. You'll recall that fixed costs are those which do not change as the level of output changes. A firm's fixed cost includes the rent that it pays on its land or the retail space that it's using, and the interest that it's paying a bank for a loan that it took out, the repayment of loans, for example. Those are fixed costs. Landlords don't care whether your bakery produces 1 croissant or 1,000 croissants. Landlords want to be paid the same rent every month. The bank that you borrowed money from does not care the level of your output. They want to be repaid the fixed amount that they loaned you every month. So the fixed costs, the total fixed costs, do not change. However, average fixed costs decrease as output increases. So if we choose any level of output here, let's look at the level of 2 units, 4 units, 6 units, and 8 units. Let's assume that this firm has a total fixed cost of $100. That includes the rent that it pays and the interest that it pays on its capital. The average fixed cost at any level of output will just be the total fixed cost divided by that quantity of output. So we've got 2, 4, 6. We'll just do those 3 here. The average fixed cost when this firm produces 2 units is 100 divided by 2, which is 50. However, when output increases, notice that the average fixed cost decreases. Now we have 100 divided by 4, which is 25. And if output increases to 6 units, the average fixed cost continues to decrease. 100 divided by 6 is 16.7. So if we took these 3 different levels of output here, the average fixed cost would always be the distance between the average variable cost and the average total cost. And we can see that that distance becomes less and less as output increases. The average variable cost and average total cost must get closer and closer together as output increases because the average fixed cost is getting smaller and smaller. So that's another very important lesson when we study our short-run cost curves. The distance between AVC and ATC becomes less and less due to the fact that a firm's average fixed costs are decreasing as its level of output increases. In accounting, this is referred to as spreading the overhead. Overhead costs are fixed costs. As a firm's output increases, the average fixed cost gets less and less since it's producing more output and spreading those fixed costs out over a wider range of output. So let's see, have we covered everything here? The marginal cost curve slopes downwards when the firm experiences increasing marginal returns, and then slopes upwards because the firm eventually experiences diminishing marginal returns. Average costs slope downwards as long as marginal cost is less than the average cost, and that holds true for average total as well. And eventually average costs begin sloping upwards if additional units cost more than the average unit cost. That explains why marginal cost must intersect both average total and average variable cost curves at their lowest points. So we can put a couple points here and say that these points represent the minimum ATC and the minimum AVC. Now we're getting closer to understanding how a firm can go about maximizing its profits. As we will see in later lessons, a firm's profits sometimes are maximized when its average total cost is minimized. So looking at our firm here, this firm knows that if it produces around 7 units, its average total cost is at its lowest point. So 7 is the cost minimizing level of output. Once we have examined the revenues that a firm earns, and that will come in a later lesson when we add revenue curves to our graphs, we will be able to come up with what is called a profit maximization rule, which helps a firm determine the level of output at which its total profits are maximized. And in order to do this, we must take into account the total costs. In fact, we must take into account the marginal costs as well and the average total costs. Once we add revenue curves to this graph and we have an average revenue and a marginal revenue curve, we will be able to determine the profit maximizing quantity. So that wraps up this lesson. The whole point here was to examine the relationships that exist between a firm's short-run costs of production, specifically the marginal cost, the average variable cost, and the average total cost. Thank you for watching.